Okay, everybody. Well, good afternoon or potentially good morning, depending upon where in the world we may find you today. My name is Patrick von Schlag, and I am a consultant and educator and mentor helping organizations adopt and adapt best practice frameworks of various kinds, including ITIL and Agile practices and a number of other things. And appreciate everyone being part of today's webinar here. Today, we're going to talk about the new ITIL 4, and as I often refer to this, kind of a great convergence of all these various best practice frameworks we've been coordinating and working with over the last 20 to 25 years, really all coming together in this new ITIL 4 framework that we're going to discuss today. Okay. So for those of you who may not be familiar with kind of what ITIL is and how we got here, the ITIL framework began more than 30 years ago. The very first draft of ITIL came out in the late 1980s and was produced as a public-private partnership by a large number of entities, public and private, large and small, coordinated by the UK government. And so what they were attempting to do, of course, was to try to come up with some sequence of good practices for running an IT organization. And what they came up with in that initial run was more or less like 40 pamphlets. In total, about 1,400 pages of best practice guidance on how to run an IT shop. This has gone through many, many revisions since then. Was consolidated into 7 core books in ITIL, what we called ITIL version 2 in 1997, consolidated again down into 3 books in 2007, what we call it ITIL version 3, underwent a major refresh in 2011, and now is undergoing a refresh again. And so what ITIL effectively is a set of practices for running a shop soup to nuts, from strategic planning to design and transition practices to operational support to improvement activities and so forth. So in this particular program, I'm going to try to give you in a fairly short period of time a broad understanding of what this is. We'll talk about the ITIL credentialing scheme. We'll talk a little bit about its history. We'll talk about some of the specific things that really get called out in this particular refresh. Talk about kind of the so what question. Why is this beneficial to you and your organization? Why are people interested in this in the broader context of how we help deliver value to customers? And then we'll introduce the 2 core parts of the framework. We'll talk about what's called the ITIL service value system, and then we'll talk about this notion of the 4 dimensions and how they really work together to support a coherent set of practices for running an IT shop. All right, so again, this all began way back in the 1980s, right? And was, at the time, there was a very large-scale public-private partnership that took place across literally hundreds of different organizations. More than 90 countries had various representatives who were involved in that first iteration of ITIL that came out in the late 1980s. And that's really when I became first exposed to it, because I ended up with a big rough draft of it right on my desk. And at the time I was working for a pharmaceutical company with a UK base, and they asked me to review this guidance and to go through and start looking for ways to implement these things. And so when we took a look through all that, we found out really 2 things. Number one, that most of this kind of makes sense, that, a lot of the things that you see in any best practice framework make a lot of sense if you think about them. But then when you ask the second question, is this what we actually do? Then you could have some hard conversations, right? Where do our practices diverge? And what does that really do to us? What does that really mean? And how does that create challenges for us? So this thing has been revised many, many times over the years. Starting in 2014, the UK government worked together with a UK-based consultant company called Capita to form an organization called Oxalos. And they're the ones who now effectively hold and coordinate the creation of the guidance. But by and large, this is largely crowdsourced. There are primary authors for the various consulting pieces, but literally tens of thousands of people get to put their thumbprints on this stuff. And it really does reflect a consolidated set of practices that have been more or less beaten to death over the last 30 years. So these really represent proven practices that real organizations and real practitioners use to go drive work and go drive results for their organization. And again, one of the fundamental reasons I really like this is because it's not some academic theory. It's driven by people who have jobs, who have specific obligations to go and use this to drive results within their organizations. And it's been proven out over a very long period of time. Well, needless to say, between 2011 and today, lots of things have changed. And so the need for an ITIL 4 update is pretty obvious at this point, because lots and lots and lots of practices have evolved over the last 10 years, especially around agile practices for development, use of things like lean IT for streamlining practices, and the emergence of DevOps practices as well. So in the new ITIL 4, they've completely transformed the entire certification approach. All right, so if you look at it, it begins as previous versions of ITIL did with the foundational guidance. And foundations is still the place that people will need to start in order to gain awareness of the framework. One thing that perhaps will be a little challenging is that people who hold the previous version of ITIL Foundation will need to take it again. And the reason is actually pretty simple. A large majority of the content has changed. And they've added a lot of additional guidance and a lot of additional scope to ITIL Foundations. And so it really becomes necessary for someone to go through and re-credentialize in Foundation. Now, one thing to understand about ITIL 4 is that it's not done yet. So they've released the Foundations guidance, but over the rest of 2019 and perhaps into early 2020, they will be continuing to release the rest of the guidance components. And so with that, a lot of the ancillary certifications that will really be needed to help organizations adopt and implement a lot of these practices are very much still in the process of forming out. But here's what the certification scheme is going to look like. So within this, there are really three kind of core intermediate credentials: ITIL Specialist, ITIL Strategist, and ITIL Leader. And you can see the corresponding classes that people will be expected to take and examinations that they will be expected to challenge in order to be able to gain those credentials. If someone has gained the ITIL Specialist credential and taken the strategist program called Direct, Plan, and Improve, that makes them eligible for what is now called the ITIL Managing Professional, which is the ITIL 4 version of ITIL Expert. If you're an existing ITIL 3 expert, or you have accumulated 17 credits in the traditional approach, there will be an alternative for you to take a Managing Professional Transition program, which will allow you effectively to jump the line and go directly to the Managing Professional credential. On the right hand side, you'll notice there's another credential called Strategic Leader, which is very much targeted, as you would expect, for people who are working in management and leadership roles, whose job it is to ensure that they're following good service management best practices in how they provision and deliver services within their organization. So why an update now? Right, this of course begins with stuff that's pretty obvious. The world has changed a lot. Right, so, and the ITIL framework as a matter of scope has changed a tremendous amount over the last 20-some years as well. When ITIL was first launched, it was very much launched as a process framework. Right, here are a set of processes to carry out to be able to do certain kinds of things you need to be able to do within your organization. Manage incidents, manage change, establish configuration controls, establish service level agreements, things like that. Right. As we moved into the ITIL version 3 and ITIL 2011 universe, the focus shifted, although not everybody fully kind of got this shift, from the processes themselves to the services that we deliver as IT organizations. And so this really began our conversation about thinking end to end. Services are how we facilitate value for customers, right? By provisioning various hardware and software and support capabilities and other things to help customers perform work and get certain outcomes that they want. In ITIL version 4, this continues to evolve. And now the focus again shifts from focusing on the services that we deliver to the value that we help co-create with our clients. Now, one of the fundamental principles in ITIL 4 is that value is co-created. In other words, there's things that we do as a service provider, and there's things that they do as a service consumer. And it's the combination of those things that produces something that's valuable. And so this begs really good questions right away. As a service provider, how well do we understand the customer? How well do we understand when and where and why they use services to produce certain things that they want? And how well does our service really enable them to do that? And so within the context of ITIL 4, the focus shifts very explicitly to managing the life cycle of value, right? How and for whom is value created for our service consumers, for other stakeholders, and for us as a service provider so we can sustain ourselves, right? And then ultimately, the other big thing in ITIL 4 is that taking into account all of the new adaptive practices that are happening as a result of the larger move within IT toward broad digital transformation, right? Over the last 10 years, I suspect all of you have seen an increase in the need for speed, that our organizations need things faster and more responsively than ever before. And that the necessity of coordinating and collaborating, not only within internal IT organizations, but especially across various customers and supplier chains, is accelerating. Right? And one of the things I tend to ask my customers in foundations classes, once you've kind of acknowledged this pace change, is this really ever going to get any better? Probably not. It's probably going to get worse. It's probably going to get even faster. And so our ability to be adaptive, to be agile, to borrow the term, is becoming strategically sensible, right? We have to be able to adapt quickly just to tread water, much less to be able to create competitive advantage for our customers. In addition, most organizations, especially if you work in senior management or on a board of directors, are spending their nights worrying about being disintermediated. We might call this the Uber effect, right? Where the creation of businesses like Uber or Airbnb suddenly changes the business model by which people, rent, and get from place to place or where they spend the night. So, Uber doesn't own any cars or any drivers, and yet they've fundamentally disintermediated how taxis work. Airbnb doesn't own any properties, and yet they fundamentally challenge the hotel industry, right? And so most organizations are stressed out about this. What could be out there? What kinds of digital models could be out there that could fundamentally compromise our go-to-market strategy and how we serve customers? And so with that, ITIL 4 helps us look at how to establish coherent practices to be able to adapt in this era of very, very rapid change. And again, we leverage good practices from many, many other frameworks and models in ITIL 4. So the need for agility and speed has been driven in agile practices, in DevOps, in lean, and a lot of other disciplines. And ultimately, ITIL 4 reflects the best practices that we've gained from all of these other initiatives as people continue to experiment and try to identify better ways to deliver value. Also, of course, we have seen a transformation in the focus on customer experience. And from the lean universe, a focus on establishing and understanding what we might call our value stream. How are the various activities and information components of the work that we do producing value for the customer? And how effectively does that work? And then given that, what kinds of opportunities present themselves for driving improvements against those things? Okay, so some of the benefits around adopting ITIL practices organizationally really come down to letting somebody else take some of the arrows for you. A lot of the things that you'll see in the ITIL guidance are practices that have been implemented successfully in thousands and thousands and thousands of different organizations, large and small, public sector, private sector, military, civilian, doesn't really matter, your business organization, right? And ultimately, they reflect practices that have been proven out, proven to work. Now, as with any best practice framework, the strategy is to adopt these capabilities and then to adapt them in ways that are appropriate for your particular organization. Think about it just as right-sizing these practices in a way that makes sense in your particular organization. Ultimately, ITIL is very much about achieving balance. Balance between our ability to be agile and our ability to maintain stability. Our ability to maintain our existing capabilities and needs, and to be able to support innovative new approaches our businesses may need in order to maintain their competitiveness. And in certain cases, perhaps to support entirely new models for how we deliver value to customers and how we work together to provision and deliver capabilities. So there's two main parts to the ITIL 4 framework. And we're going to go through each of these pieces, at least at a high level in this webinar. So the first of these is what we'll call the service value system. So the service value system, as the diagram would show you, really begins with various types of opportunities potentially to serve customers, some of which may be realistic, some of which may not be realistic. And ultimately, at some point, there may be real demand that those opportunities present to be able to support our businesses, to be able to support certain needs, wishes, and dreams they have. And ultimately, of course, our job at the end is to be able to help facilitate the co-creation of value. In other words, we're supposed to provision certain service capabilities, and they're supposed to do things with them. And the combination of what we do and what they do helps us produce things that are valuable. Now, along the way, there are various things we need to be able to do to be able to convert that demand into something that's going to be valuable for our clients. And so within the service value system, we break that into 5 key parts: some guiding principles, governance and oversight, what we'll call our service value chain, key practices, which is really the heart and soul of the ITIL framework in version 4, as well as establishing a culture of continuous improvement. So if you take a look at the diagram here, it will tell you a little bit about the different parts of the value system. Right? So when we consider, for example, the service value chain, eventually we do things. We engage in what we'll simply call activities, carrying out work of various kinds. And we'll talk about the different types of activities we might carry out. But we may do these in some different combination of ways to serve customers and deliver value. And so ultimately, we need to be able to do things like plan things, engage with stakeholders, design services, manage transitions, operate and deliver and support services, obtain and build components, and so forth. And some combination of those activities is going to need to happen in order for us to produce something that's going to be useful for our clients. The core of the framework are the ITIL practices. So as opposed to processes in previous flavors of ITIL, in ITIL 4 and onward, the focus will be more broadly on practices. We'll talk about these, but within the ITIL 4 guidance, there will be 34 practice guides that will explicitly talk about how to establish those kinds of practices within an enterprise. Borrowing from what was called the ITIL guiding principles in the previous ITIL practitioner guidance, ITIL 4 establishes a set of overarching guiding principles. In other words, when we're trying to accomplish some objective, is there a lens we would want to bring to that to be able to ensure we kind of keep our eyes on the prize, broadly speaking, in terms of certain key things we want to be able to remember as we go through and we start trying to implement some of these capabilities. Establishing alignment and governance and oversight is certainly important. Figuring out how we evaluate strategic alternatives, direct actions, and establish monitoring and oversight over the things that we do is going to be important. And then last, and perhaps as important as anything else within the framework, is the emphasis on continual improvement and continual improvement culture, to be able to establish within the organization and within the entire service value system a focus on driving continual improvement against all of the things that we do, against our activities, against our practices, and so forth. All right, so now let's take a look at each of these pieces a little bit in turn, so you can look at how the various parts of the service value system combine to support an overall value system. So the first of these things we'll call the service value chain. Now, in previous versions of ITIL, we had this idea called the service life cycle. And the service life cycle consisted of 5 main areas of focus: service strategy, service design, service transition, service operations, and service improvement. And unfortunately, previous ITIL processes were embedded in these particular almost phases of a life cycle of a service. And so people often brought a kind of restricted plate, kind of linear approach to thinking about the processes and thinking about them as having a particular place within a service's life cycle in which they lived. And of course, for any of you who've done this work, you'll understand that it's all much more complicated than that. And in fact, it's not nearly as linear as those particular approaches would lend you to think. And so in the ITIL 4 guidance, they instead introduce this very loosely coupled set of value chain activities. And in short, you're going to combine these in dozens or hundreds of different ways, depending upon the things that you're trying to do, the practices you're executing, the value you're trying to deliver, in order to create results for your clients. But at the end of the day, there are certain core capabilities we need to be able to bring to bear in different ways to serve customers at different points in time. And so they break these out into these value chain activities. Now, to be as clear as possible, this is not nice linear sequence. Right? You're going to combine these in lots and lots of different ways in different contexts, depending upon what it is you're trying to get done. All right? But at the end of the day, we need to be able to plan things. We need to be able to improve things. We need to be able to engage with our stakeholders and suppliers in various ways at various times. We need to be able to design and transition services, whether we're building them or buying them. We need to be able to obtain and build components, whether we're getting them from some third party or whether we're building them ourselves. And of course, we need to be able to deliver and support services for our clients. Okay, and so what you'll see is the various ITIL practices work across all of these, some more than others, right? So for example, if I'm doing incident management, probably doing some delivery and support work, but I'm almost certainly engaging with users and customers, and I may need to obtain and build certain components to take care of that and resolve that incident and things like that. And so the various aspects of the value chain are engaged in different ways as you carry out the practice work. And so a big part of what they're trying to get us to think about is how these value chains are recombined at different points in time to create something that's useful. And eventually, we want to be able to establish some coherent, reusable procedures and work instructions for how we carry out and do a lion's share of the work that we do. And so eventually, it becomes some combination of these activities, taking inputs in, performing certain things, producing certain outputs out, and it's the combination of these activities taken together that helps us to produce something that the customer would find valuable. Now, the core part of the framework are going to be a series of practice guides. Now, I'll suggest to you that all of this stuff is still a little theoretical. because none of these practice guides have been published yet. But the intention is to publish and to be able to iterate a series of 34 practice guides. Now, the practice baskets really come in three types. There are things that come from general management practice. There are things that come specifically out of service management that have really been developed in ITSM for ITSM. And then there are a series of technical practices that have been developed over time for carrying out certain technical capabilities. Now, on these particular slides, we identify the practices that get covered in, for example, an ITIL 4 Foundation program. And you'll notice it's actually a pretty small subset of the total pool. So there are 34 practices overall in the ITIL guidance. But in the ITIL Foundation program, we really only touch on 15 of them. And we really only spend a tremendous amount of quality time on about 7 of those. Now, obviously, the opportunity here is to make sure that we're providing a level of detail that's really useful on those, with the understanding that, yes, there's a lot of other things, right? And so the programs that are focused on the more detailed practice implementation for those ITIL intermediate programs are going to be more inherently needed for a lot of people who are going to be implementing a lot of these other practices. So the general management practices began in other industries, in other disciplines, and have really been ported into the information technology universe. So things like continual improvement, of course, began in general business. And then, of course, over time, that's become a fundamental part of what we do in IT, but it's a fundamental part of what every other business organization does too. And again, if you look down the practice list, things like knowledge management, organizational change, portfolio management, project management, these are all important disciplines, but they're not distinct to IT. Right? They began in other general business models and then eventually were adapted into IT. And the ITIL guidance for ITIL 4 will publish practice guides for organizations implementing each of these particular types of practice areas. Again, the service management practices really are more native born to IT. Right? And so here again, the focus is on establishing practices that are, again, are going to be reusable, that are going to help us figure out resources and pools and alignment and so forth. And you'll notice again that there are a number of these core practices that we'll cover in some detail within an ITIL Foundation curriculum. And then there are a number of these other practices that are going to get detailed coverage in the advanced programs. Lastly, we have a series of technical management practices. Again, for those of you who may be familiar with previous versions of ITIL, ITIL made a big idea of a big gap in the past between what was a process and what was a function. And now they treat all of these things as practice areas. So you'll see in infrastructure and platform management and software development management, things that look a little bit like infrastructure management or technical management and application management from previous versions of ITIL. They've also provided a lot of explicit guidance on things like deployment. This becomes particularly important for organizations that are considering adopting certain types of DevOps approaches, because in the DevOps universe, we've really transformed how deployment gets done and how deployment really gets decoupled from when software is released and introduced to customers and made available for their use. Okay, so within the ITIL 4 guidance, you'll see a lot of specific things that reflect practices that have come in from Lean, that have come in from practices like DevOps and Agile, that now become fundamental parts of the ITIL 4 approach. So in 2015, the Oxalos folks introduced a certification for ITIL 2011 called ITIL Practitioner. Not a tremendous number of people were fully aware of this guidance, but effectively what it did was help organizations who began working with ITIL, and maybe it had some people go to ITIL Foundations training, to start looking at how do we do this work? How do we take all this guidance and all this information out of here go back to our offices and start figuring out what to do with that. And so the ITIL practitioner guidance was much more explicitly defined as a how-to, right? And a lot of that how-to work began with a series of guiding principles, right? What approach should we take to trying to assess existing practices and to be able to move forward in a way that makes some sense? And so in the ITIL 4 guidance, and as a fundamental part of the service value system, they introduce what are now the 7 core guiding principles. Now, the whole point of a guiding principle is that it's something that we could use to guide our thinking in any kind of situation. Doesn't mean we always have to use them, doesn't mean that they're always applicable, but they're good places to kind of start our thinking. And so within the ITIL 4 guidance, the 7 guiding principles begin with a focus on value. Is what I'm doing creating value for my customer? If not, do I have to? Is there some way I could stop doing this so that I could focus instead on things that were going to create better results for us? Start where you are, right? To be able to begin implementing practices by assessing your current practices. What's working? What's maybe not working so well? Are there certain capabilities, information that you can leverage from your existing practices as you go forward and you start identifying potential improvements that you may want to do? Progressing iteratively with feedback. Again, this is very much driven by what we've learned over the last 15 to 20 years implementing practices like Agile and DevOps. In short, we don't really know everything. And so as we go and we start trying to implement things, we want to implement a little bit at a time, and we want to establish feedback mechanisms so that we can learn. Because when we learn, we're probably going to change our minds about some things. And we may want to adapt what we do in some different ways in order to be able to produce something that's going to be valuable for our client. So as we approach implementing or adopting certain practices, how do we do that in bite-sized chunks, and how do we create the right feedback mechanism so we can see what we're doing? Collaboration and promoting visibility. Within the Agile universe, there's a tremendous influence on what in the Agile space we call information radiators. In other words, creating broad visibility among all the relevant stakeholders as to where we are, who's got what, and how things are going. Along with that, in practices like Kanban, come the idea of limiting the amount of work in progress, creating effective flow, and being able to establish pull-based systems so that capacity is more efficiently utilized and that work doesn't find itself just sitting around waiting for somebody to do it. Thinking and working holistically expands on things that we've been working on really back into the 1990s and even before that, with the broader ideas of systems thinking. In other words, how does the whole system work? How does the whole workflow produce value for the customer? How do we ensure that our improvements improve the whole system and not just some little subset of it? And in particular, how do we make sure that we aim our improvements against things that are going to really move the needle at the end of the day and that don't just create bigger and bigger bottlenecks somewhere else in the system? Keep it simple and practical reminds us to focus on things that are important and just kind of streamline the processes and the work that we do to keep it as efficient and effective as possible. And then, as has always been the case, once we've identified a set of good practices, a set of processes and value streams we can leverage and use, how can we streamline and make those more optimal? How can we leverage and use automation to help do that more efficiently and more effectively over time? Now, again, the idea of the guiding principles is a simple one. This is kind of what we're trying to win. So when we approach trying to implement practices, when we approach trying to implement software tools, when we approach trying to solve a customer problem, this gives us a kind of a high-level spectrum to think through. Right? How do we ensure that we're focused on things that are valuable? How do we assess current practice? How do we create visibility, and so forth and so on? So along with continual improvement and governance, those are the key parts of what we call the service value system, right? And so again, the core part of the ITIL guidance is the service value system, right? I want to be able to get opportunities and demand in the door, and I want to eventually be able to produce something that's going to co-create value out the door. And so ultimately, it becomes a question of then how do we execute so that we can actually convert this thing on the front end into something that's valuable in the back end. The other key main part of the framework is this idea of the 4 dimensions. Right? So in previous versions of ITIL, the focus was very, very much on process. Right? And so most people, and most other frameworks for that matter, looked at ITIL as a process framework. That's certainly what COBIT thought of ITIL. It's what a lot of other people think of ITIL too. Right? There's nothing inherently bad about that, but it's an incomplete view of the world. Right? So as a consultant, I would go in and work with different organizations helping to adopt these things, and they would become very hyper-focused, either on the process architecture, the process adoption, or perhaps on a tool implementation. Maybe they were working on implementing a particular vendor tool, and they would get very, very, very focused on that piece of it to the exclusion of all the rest of it. Right? It doesn't take a whole lot of rocket science to assess that, that's that kind of myopic approach to the world. It's probably not going to work for you. And we've all seen examples of what happens when we get real hyper-focused on one part of the problem and we don't bring a broader holistic view to it. So the idea of the 4 dimensions codifies this. So when we implement a practice, when we establish governance, when we're driving continual improvement, when we're establishing value chains and the like, we want to think holistically across these 4 dimensions. The first dimension, organizations and people. Okay, which people are doing which things? How do we define roles and responsibilities, manage communication and collaboration and coordination, solve those kind of left-hand, right-hand problems? In my way of thinking about it, this is really the fundamental problem of life. He said that, she said that, they said. Right? And so ultimately, what you're trying to do is to get some clarity around who's going to be carrying out which activities and when, and how do we get that information transmitted to the relevant stakeholders. That plays then into the second one, information and technology. And again, we can think about that in the context of the services we provide. What information are we transmitting and managing, as well as the various technologies that we use to provision and deliver that, hardware and software, data, documentation, all those relevant pieces. And then, of course, there's the information and technology that we need in order to be able to run an IT organization. And eventually, again, this whole idea of information technology, that's really kind of what we do. We have information coming in the door, we're doing stuff to it, we have information going out the door, which begs really good questions like what's coming in, where do we get it, what do we do with it, where does it go, who needs it, how do we make sure the right information gets to the right stakeholders. So in IT, of course, we use lots of tools, and we certainly need them and want them, but we want to be sure that we understand how we're using them and what for. All right, so going back to the first one, which people are putting various information in, who needs information and status and visibility into certain things, and how do we provide the proper outputs to the relevant stakeholders as well. So again, it's not about the tool itself, but how we use it to ensure that we're doing the right collaboration and communications. This becomes very extended now that most of us work in highly multi-vendor environments. So when we establish any of these practices, we have to think about alignment across our various partners and suppliers. Right? How do we create the right collaboration and communications models, for example, if I'm using an outsourced service desk, or if I'm doing an escalation to a third-party team, or if I'm trying to manage change, or I'm trying to establish and monitor and report on service levels. Right? So again, some of this stuff is easier to coordinate and collaborate inside my organization's four walls. How do we extend that to be able to effectively integrate and align with our relevant partners and suppliers? And then last and certainly not least, we have what we have traditionally thought of as processes. Process, again, really describes how inputs come in, activities that we do, and outputs we deliver. All right, and to borrow from the lean language, what is the nature of the value stream that we produce? So in other words, how does each of these steps contribute to value we deliver, or value that we help co-create then with our client? In turn, right, what is the efficiency and effectiveness of how both the information and that workflow happen? Are we doing the right things? Are we taking extra steps? Do we have areas where we have waste in our workflow? Are there ways we can streamline that in a way to improve our overall quality of service, save resources, save time, and so forth? So the first part of the whole four dimensions idea is just casting the net this way. Not that we haven't always had these, but we haven't always focused our adoption approaches across this broad of a lens. So what are the implications for our people and organizations, defining roles and responsibilities? What do we need in terms of information and information sharing and collaboration? How do our tools help us facilitate that? How do we manage our collaboration models outside our organization with our partners and suppliers? How do we establish what our value streams and processes look like? And then how do we streamline and create efficiencies in how we do what we do with those? Right. You'll notice around the four dimensions, we have these various factors. Okay, you'll often hear these abbreviated PESTLE, P-E-S-T-L-E. Right, because they affect how we do what we do with the four dimensions. There are political layer issues that we have to deal with in how we coordinate and manage things, many times making sure that the right people are communicated with about certain things that we're trying to do. There are economic factors that will be involved, in order to be able to manage our costs and to be able to ensure that the value we're delivering is cost justifiable. There may be various social factors involved in creating the right buy-in and commitment among the various stakeholders in how we're trying to do what we do. Certainly, there will be technological factors in how we provision and deliver things. Just because a tool, for example, can track something doesn't mean I want to. I have a lot of customers, for example, who have adopted enterprise-type Agile tools to support their Agile implementations. And while the tools themselves can be tremendously useful, the challenge is that in traditional project management, they spend lots and lots and lots of time writing documentation, right? And all that time I'm spending writing documentation and reports, what I'm not doing is producing the solution I'm supposed to be producing, right? And so we end up spending more energy on the artifacts than we do on the solution that we're trying to provision. Well, now that organizations are moving to some of these more agile tools, we see replications of that behavior starting to occur, where people are spending more and more and more of their cycles putting data into these tools that may be way above and beyond what is useful. Right? Just because a tool enables it doesn't mean we want it. Right? And so technological factors certainly have a play in what's possible, and they may, of course, have broad strategic implications for organizational go-to-market strategies if somebody can come up with an innovative digital approach to being able to solve different types of customer problems. Legal factors certainly play a role. There are things we're allowed to do. There are things we're not allowed to do. Those certainly will constrain our policies and will ultimately constrain things like our processes and value streams as well as various types of reporting that will be required to do to maintain legal and compliance requirements. And then last and certainly not least, there may be environmental impacts or opportunities to streamline our practices in ways that may produce environmental improvements, cause less environmental degradation and the like. So this provides a short summary of the 4 dimensions in the ITIL guidance itself. Organizations and people are very much about roles and responsibilities. Who's got what is, as far as I'm concerned, the deep fundamental problem of life. And so a big part of establishing coherent, reusable practices, effective and efficient value streams and processes is figuring out who's going to do which thing. Right? You have lots of alternatives in how an organization can adopt those things, but eventually what you're looking for is a certain level of certainty so that the organization kind of knows how to execute and do the things it needs to do at those appropriate periods in time. Information and technology, again, has 2 main ways of thinking about it. The information and technologies we deliver for our customers, as well as the information and technologies that we use to run ourselves as IT. And so we want to be able to ensure that each of those is fit for purpose, that it meets the needs that we had intended. And so in order to be able to do that, we want to try to size this appropriately. What is the level of information that we need to transmit? How do we create the right collaboration and communications? And then how do we use our tools to help facilitate that effectively? In the multi-vendor environments that we're all working in now, being able to properly align with our partners and suppliers and to create something that creates a seamless experience for our clients is becoming critical. Because of course the clients don't care who's provisioning what. From their perspective, it's all IT stuff, and their interest is in being able to carry out their work and get the results they want. And so there's certainly an incumbent need for us to figure out how to create the proper alignment with our suppliers so that we are working as partner teams to help drive improvements to the services we deliver. And then last and certainly not least, the value streams and processes, which is a big part of the practices, right? Figuring out the activity sequences, figuring out procedures and work instructions, establishing controls and reporting and monitoring, telemetry and other kinds of things that we'll need in order to be able to deliver value to clients. Okay, so that's a whole lot of stuff in a fairly short period of time. I'd like to go ahead and open it up for you guys to ask questions now. If you want to go ahead and chat into the chat window, if you have specific questions you want me to address, I'm certainly happy to answer any questions for you as we go. So with that, if you have any questions, go ahead and chat them in and we'll try to address them one at a time, and we'll stay until all the questions get answered. So the first question that's come in, would I say overall a partial adoption of ITIL is possible, or is it the approach to focus on certain key areas? Virtually all organizations do some partial adoption of ITIL. And ultimately, it's almost impossible to implement all of the ITIL guidance, and it's probably not even desirable to do that. And so eventually, one of the things you want to be able to do is to think about things like, okay, what are the things that are really burning issues within your particular organization, right? Where should we focus our energy to try to get results and value for the things that we need? So again, the framework is almost impossibly broad, right? So there's 34 different practice areas that will be, in the guidance. And within that, most organizations have areas of focus around operational support, around design, around strategic planning and portfolio management, those kinds of things. And so in general, most organizations pick a subset of areas to focus on first. So I have a couple customers I'm working with right now. One of them heavily focused on improving their change management practices, establishing their service models and their service catalogs. Another one is focused on optimization and improvement of their service desk practice, enabling them to do a better job of incident management, request fulfillment activities, and the like. And so you will find that every organization has different needs. I've done probably 400 different adoption programs, and no two of them really look alike. And so eventually there's a whole lot of guidance here, and then it becomes that question of, what do you want to focus on within your organization that's going to make things make sense for you. Dawn asked whether the presentation will be made available after the session. We will certainly endeavor to do that so that that's available on request if you would like it. How does an organization know just what the right mix is? They experiment. All right, and so ultimately what I'm going to suggest to you is that, there's often a couple ways to approach these. One is that people bring the tourniquet approach, what's really bleeding the most, right? And how do we help identify ways to try to improve this thing that's obviously causing us a lot of pain? In other areas, you can be more opportunistic. Are there certain places within your organization that present themselves as meaningful opportunities for streamlining and improvement? So a lot of the organizations, for example, that have implemented DevOps practices look at how organizations do testing and validation, release and deployment, and how quickly they can establish and start driving feedback loops to their development teams as meaningful ways to help them focus on improving their value stream to their customers. And so it's not so much that it's broken, but there's a real opportunity to improve those things and to gain some serious benefits associated with that. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and say thank you to all of you. I appreciate you investing the time. I hope that you got some benefits from the program today. WebAge will be announcing availability of the ITIL 4 certification program on its public schedule, so keep an eye open for that. The timeline for the certifications right now, ITIL 4 Foundation is available now, and we will be starting to run a public schedule in June for that we would encourage you to take a look at if you're interested. All of the remaining certifications for ITIL 4 will be being launched between now and the end of 2019. That is all the guidance that we have received from the accreditor, from Oxalos at this point. And we are all pretty much sitting on the edge of our chairs waiting for all the rest of the guidance to be published. I'm part of a review group that has been looking at some of the rough draft practice guides. It's worth it. The content is going to be really robust. It's going to be really, really effective. And I think that people that spend time, invest in getting aware of what's going to be in there, going to find it real consumable and real practical, that you'll be able to leverage and use those things pretty quickly. All right, everybody. Thank you very much for your time and energy today. I hope you enjoyed the program. Hope to have you in next time. And have a great rest of your week and a good weekend, everyone.